In medieval times, when food was scarce, people had to get inventive with what they had. What they came up with may surprise you. Let's dive into the unexpected ways they stretched their supplies and survived during the toughest of times. Bread was one of the most essential staples for survival, but not always the kind you'd expect. Wheat bread was a luxury, often out of reach during wars, plagues, and famines. Peasants had to get creative with whatever was available. When grain supplies ran low, acorn flour bread became common. Acorns were full of bitter tannins that needed soaking to wash out before grinding. The resulting bread was dense and bitter. Nothing like the soft loaves we know today, but it got the job done. Bark flour made from trees like pine or birch was another substitute. Mixed with a bit of real grain flour, it produced something only loosely resembling bread. And it certainly wasn't tasty. In even tougher times, powdered chalk was added to stretch flour supplies. Chalk bread had a gritty texture and left a strange mineral aftertaste. During severe famines, sawdust sometimes found its way into the mix, often boiled first to soften it before blending with flour. It offered little nutrition but helped fill empty stomachs. Peasants also tried to salvage spoiled grain by cutting away the worst parts and mixing what was left with water or scraps, turning it into moldy grain cakes. Another desperate option was stale bread soaked in poor quality ale, which softened it and added a few extra calories. At the very bottom of the barrel were burned crusts scraped from communal ovens, black, bitter scraps sometimes chewed, ashes, or mixed with water. Bean flour flatbreads, while dense and chewy, offered a bit more nutrition thanks to the protein from beans. Monastery bread, often made from grain, frequently arrived hard as a rock, forcing peasants to soften it in water, soup, or ale before eating. In the harshest times, bread was made from a mix of all these substitutes: acorns, bark, chalk, sawdust, resulting in something barely resembling bread, but it was what kept people alive. But when bread supplies ran out, medieval folk had to look elsewhere for sustenance. When crops failed and food stores emptied, medieval peasants turned to the natural world around them. Foraging became an essential survival skill passed down through generations. The woods, meadows, and even roadside ditches offered free food for those who knew where to look. Boiled nettles were among the most common foraged foods. Despite their painful sting when touched, once boiled, stinging nettles become perfectly edible and surprisingly nutritious. Rich in iron, calcium, and vitamin C, nettle soup could help prevent the scurvy that often accompanied famine. Young nettles picked in spring were preferred, but during desperate times, even tougher summer nettles would be harvested. Medieval moms had to tell their kids, "Don't touch that plant unless we're having it for dinner." Dandelion leaf stew was another springtime staple during food shortages. Every part of the dandelion plant is edible, from the roots to the bright yellow flowers. The leaves, similar to modern arugula, provided vital nutrients when few vegetables were available. Peasants would collect the greens, boil them to reduce bitterness, and add whatever scraps of fat or meat might be available to create a filling meal. Wild turnips required more effort to harvest but offered substantial sustenance. Smaller and more bitter than their cultivated cousins, these root vegetables could be roasted directly in hot coals or boiled in pots. They weren't tasty by modern standards, but they filled empty stomachs and provided valuable carbohydrates when bread was scarce. Fern roots became an important food source in woodland areas. Certain varieties, particularly bracken fern, have starchy rhizomes that can be dug up, cleaned, and roasted or boiled. The taste was described as similar to potatoes, but with a stronger, earthier flavor. However, some ferns contain harmful compounds, so knowledge of which types were safe was crucial survival information. Thistle soup might sound like a punishment, but hungry peasants knew that beneath the painful spines, thistles hide edible stems and roots. After carefully removing the spines, these parts could be boiled into a soup. Young thistle shoots were sometimes eaten like asparagus when other greens were unavailable. Tree moss boiled in water became a desperate measure during the worst famines. Certain mosses contain carbohydrates that can be extracted through boiling, though the resulting food had almost no flavor and minimal nutritional value. It was basically like eating wet carpet, but when you're starving, even the carpet starts to look appetizing. Grass boiled with garlic shows just how creative hungry people can become. In extreme circumstances, peasants would gather young grass shoots, chop them finely, and boil them with whatever flavorings were available. Wild garlic, being easy to identify and abundant in many forests, became a common addition to make this desperate food somewhat palatable. Along coastal areas, raw seaweed provided crucial nutrition during inland famines. Certain seaweeds are quite nutritious, containing iodine and other minerals often lacking in medieval diets. Some types could be dried for storage, creating a long-lasting food source that prevented starvation in coastal communities. The knowledge of which wild plants were edible wasn't just helpful, it was often the difference between life and death. This wisdom was passed down from parents to children, with young ones learning from an early age which plants to gather and which to avoid. A few months ago, I had no idea what a health ring even was until my fiancée got me one, and I have to say, I'm shocked this isn't a widely known and used product. It tracks my stress levels, and what I found out is that some supplements made my stress score spike, while others actually helped bring it down. I adjusted a few things based on that, and honestly, I feel 10 years younger. My wife mainly uses it to track her menstrual cycles, and she is obsessed with her sleep quality score. I noticed they are currently running a limited 69% discount, but I don't know how long it will last. It's currently only $60, and it's clear. This one is the best bang for your buck, with other health rings priced around $350 with less functions. They managed to price it this low because they cut out the middleman like Amazon, Walmart, etc., who drive up the price and take a big margin, ending up with the customer paying 3 to 5 times more. If you are on TV, you can check it out yourself by pausing the video and scanning the QR code with your phone camera or clicking the first link in the description of this video. Mistakes could be deadly, as many edible plants have poisonous lookalikes. With growling stomachs only partially satisfied by foraged plants, medieval people turned to their cooking pots to make something more substantial. Liquid meals became the saving grace for many peasant families during hard times. Soups, stews, and broths stretched minimal ingredients to feed more mouths and utilized foods that might otherwise be inedible. A single pot simmering over the fire could provide sustenance for an entire household. Onion soup made with old water was a common meal when resources were scarce. Old water wasn't water that had been sitting around gathering dust. It was the liquid left over from cooking other foods. Nothing went to waste in a medieval kitchen. Onions were relatively easy to grow and store, making them available even in harsh times. Medieval peasants were the original inventors of reduce, reuse, recycle, except instead of saving the planet, they were just trying not to starve. Leek broth featured prominently in peasant diets during food shortages. Leeks were hardy vegetables that could withstand tough growing conditions and store reasonably well. When meat was unavailable, which was most of the time during hardships, leeks provided flavor to otherwise bland broths. The green portions were often used for livestock feed during normal times, but during famines, every part of the plant found its way into the cooking pot. Split pea porridge offered one of the more nutritious options during lean periods. Dried peas could be stored for extended times, making them valuable assets when fresh food wasn't available. When cooked down into a thick porridge, they provided protein and kept hunger at bay longer than many other foods. Archaeological evidence from medieval cesspits shows pea consumption increased during times of grain shortage. Lentil mash served a similar purpose to pea porridge. These small legumes cook relatively quickly and offer substantial protein. When properly stored, dried lentils can last for years, making them perfect famine food. They were often mashed after cooking to create a thick, filling dish that could be stretched with water when supplies ran low. In some regions, clay-thickened soup became a desperate innovation during extreme food shortages. Certain types of clay, when added to thin broths, created a thicker, more filling consistency. While the clay itself provided no nutrition, it created the sensation of fullness that helped people cope with hunger. It was basically the medieval version of diet food. Fills you up, but has 0 calories. Unfortunately, it also had 0 taste and 0 nutrition. Snail broth might turn modern stomachs, but these small creatures represented an accessible source of protein during hard times. Snails could be gathered from gardens and wild areas with relative ease. The broth created from boiling them was often used as a base for other soups, with the snail meat itself reserved as a rare protein treat. Cheese rind soaked and fried demonstrates the extreme frugality of peasant cooking. When a piece of cheese was finished, the hard rind wouldn't be discarded, but instead soaked to soften and then fried to create a flavorful addition to otherwise bland dishes. During good times, these might be added to soups for flavor. During famines, they might be the meal itself. Thinned cabbage or pickled cabbage soup was a winter staple when fresh vegetables were unavailable. Cabbage could be preserved through pickling or simply stored in cool, dry conditions for months. When fresh food ran out, preserved cabbage would be cooked into soups, often thinned with water as supplies dwindled throughout winter. Frog stew sounds like something from a fairy tale, but these amphibians represented a free source of protein for those willing to catch them. Particularly in marshy areas, frogs could be gathered in quantity during certain seasons. The meat was typically stewed with whatever vegetables or herbs were available to create a protein-rich meal during times when domestic meat was unavailable. When soups weren't enough, the hunt for protein led to some unusual meat choices. During normal times, meat was a luxury for medieval peasants, typically reserved for special occasions. During war, plague, and famine, regular sources of meat became even scarcer, forcing people to make difficult choices about what counted as food. Horse meat scraps became available when these valuable animals died or could no longer work. Horses were primarily work animals rather than food sources, but when a horse died from age, injury, or starvation during tough times, its meat wouldn't go to waste. The emotional attachment people had to working horses often made this a somber meal. Medieval peasants had their own version of farm-to-table dining, except in this case, it was more like plow to plate. Dog meat represents a truly desperate measure. Dogs were valuable for hunting, protection, and companionship, making them an absolute last resort as food. However, historical accounts from siege situations and extreme famines record that abandoned or stray dogs were sometimes consumed when no alternatives existed. The psychological toll of eating animals that had been companions shows just how desperate conditions could become. Cat stew follows a similar pattern to dog consumption. Cats were valued for controlling rodent populations in grain stores and homes. Eating them not only meant overcoming the taboo of consuming a domestic animal, but also sacrificing future rodent control. During the worst famines, this future benefit was sacrificed for immediate survival. Crow meat provided an alternative when more traditional food animals weren't available. These clever birds were difficult to catch, but they remained present in areas where other wildlife had been hunted to extinction. Crows were typically roasted over fires after being plucked. Their meat was described as tough and gamey, but during famines, any protein was welcome. Hedgehog meat roasted on stones might sound unusual today, but these spiny creatures were occasionally hunted during food shortages. After carefully removing the spines, the meat could be roasted over hot stones. While not particularly substantial, a hedgehog provided enough meat for a small meal for one person. Fish heads boiled with turnip greens shows the waste-not mentality of peasant cooking. When fish was available, every part was used. Heads, normally discarded by the wealthy, contained nutritious tissue around the cheeks and eyes. Boiled with whatever greens were available, they created a nourishing broth. Salted pork represented one of the more traditional emergency foods. During good harvests, some families could afford to slaughter a pig and preserve portions of the meat through salting. These precious reserves were carefully rationed during hard times, often used more as flavoring for other foods than as meals themselves. Salted fish guts reflect the complete utilization of every catch. When fish were cleaned, the entrails were frequently preserved through salting rather than discarded. During lean times, these preserved guts could be rinsed and added to soups or stews. While the flavor and texture might not appeal to modern tastes, they added valuable protein and fat to diets critically lacking in both. Smoked eel was considered valuable famine food in regions where these fish could be caught. Eels preserve well through smoking and provide fatty meat that offers substantial calories. In marshy areas and along riverbanks, eel traps represented an important food security strategy. Unlike many other foods, properly smoked eel could last for months. Roasted rats entered the diet during the most extreme circumstances, particularly during urban sieges when all conventional food had been consumed. Medieval siege survivors probably didn't coin the phrase, "you are what you eat," because nobody wants to think of themselves as a rat. Field mice on skewers followed similar desperation logic to rat consumption. Being smaller, multiple mice would be caught and skewered for roasting. Their tiny size made them quick to cook over even the smallest fire. Children were often tasked with setting simple traps for these small mammals when larger game had long since disappeared from the area. Archaeological evidence from middens and cesspits dating to known famine periods shows changes in bone refuse, with more small mammal and bird bones appearing alongside fewer domestic animal remains. This physical evidence confirms written accounts of dietary adaptation during crises. When fresh food was completely unavailable, preserved provisions became lifesavers, though some were quite unpleasant. When medieval peasants faced uncertain times, food preservation became crucial for survival. Without refrigeration, medieval people relied on methods that often resulted in strong-smelling but life-saving preserved foods. These techniques allowed them to store summer and autumn abundance for the lean months ahead. Pickled cabbage was a staple preserved food in many regions. Similar to modern sauerkraut, cabbage was finely chopped, layered with salt, and left to ferment in wooden barrels or ceramic crocks. The fermentation process created lactic acid that preserved the vegetable for months. Each family typically prepared several large containers after the harvest to last through winter and beyond. The smell of opening a barrel of year-old sauerkraut could clear a house faster than yelling fire, but nobody complained when it was the only dinner available. Pickled onions followed similar preservation methods. Onions naturally store reasonably well in cool, dry conditions, but pickling extended their usability even further. Small onions were often preserved whole, while larger ones might be cut into pieces before pickling. The vinegar solution not only preserved the vegetable, but also added valuable flavor to otherwise bland emergency meals. Brined garlic provided both food and medicine during difficult times. Garlic was valued not only for its flavor, but also for its perceived medicinal properties, particularly during plague outbreaks. Medieval medical theory held that strong-smelling foods could counteract bad air thought to spread illness. While fresh garlic stores relatively well naturally, preserving it in brine extended its availability. Dried peas represented one of the most reliable emergency foods. After harvest, peas were carefully dried and stored in sacks or containers protected from moisture and pests. A sack of dried peas could sustain a family for weeks during food shortages. Before cooking, they required soaking, ideally overnight, though during desperate times, this step might be shortened or skipped entirely. Dried apples stored from autumn show the importance of fruit preservation. Fresh apples were a seasonal luxury, but drying allowed this valuable source of natural sweetness to be enjoyed throughout the year. Sliced thinly and dried near the hearth or in the sun, apples could last for months when properly stored. During normal times, dried apples might be reserved for special occasions, but during food shortages, they were rationed carefully. Old butter dug out of barrels reveals a preservation method quite foreign to modern tastes. Butter was often preserved by burying it in peat bogs or storing it in barrels where it would develop a hard outer layer that protected the interior. By the time this stored butter was retrieved during food shortages, it had often developed a strong, rancid smell and taste. Nevertheless, it provided crucial fat calories when little else was available. Stale cheese demonstrates another approach to dairy preservation. Hard cheeses naturally have a long shelf life, but during extended hardships, they might be stored well beyond their prime. The hard, dried exterior would develop mold, which would be scraped away before consumption. The interior, while crumbly and sharp-tasting, remained edible. Sour beer mixed with herbs represents the fate of ale that had gone past its prime. Medieval beer spoiled quickly compared to modern brews, lacking pasteurization and proper sealing. When beer began to sour, herbs were often added to mask the increasingly unpleasant flavor. During food shortages, even badly soured beer wouldn't be discarded, as it still provided calories and safer hydration than potentially contaminated water sources. The preservation methods themselves tell us much about medieval food insecurity. The extensive effort invested in pickling, drying, smoking, and salting foods reflects a society intimately familiar with shortage. Unlike modern prepping, which is often a response to anticipated disasters, medieval food preservation was simply a normal part of the annual cycle. When these carefully preserved foods ran out, medieval peasants faced their darkest hour and their most desperate food choices. When preserved stores emptied and foraged foods became scarce, medieval peasants faced the grimmest dietary choices imaginable. These truly desperate measures represent the last stand against starvation. When anything that might provide sustenance became potential food. Rotten apples mashed and boiled showcase the waste not mentality taken to extremes. When stored apples began to rot, the spoiled portions would be cut away, and the remaining fruit mashed and boiled to create a sauce or porridge. The cooking process helped kill harmful bacteria and made the barely edible somewhat safer to consume. Some medieval peasants were the original food influencers, except instead of posting pictures of beautiful meals on social media, they were figuring out how to make rotten apples look appetizing to their starving children. Boiled shoe leather entered the diet when true starvation set in. Leather, being animal skin, contains collagen that can be extracted through extended boiling. Shoes, belts, and other leather items would be cut into pieces, thoroughly cleaned, and boiled for hours to create a thick, protein-containing broth. While offering minimal nutrition, this desperate food could temporarily ward off hunger pangs. During the Siege of Paris in 1590, historical accounts mention leather items being consumed after all conventional food sources were exhausted. Moldy rye bread presents particularly dangerous territory. When rye became infected with ergot fungus, it produced compounds that could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and even death. However, during severe famines, even this dangerous food might be consumed despite the risks. The most severely affected portions would be cut away, but consuming even small amounts of ergot could lead to symptoms that medieval people often attributed to supernatural causes rather than food poisoning. Livestock feed stolen and cooked highlights the breakdown of normal social boundaries during extreme hunger. Feed intended for remaining livestock might be secretly taken and prepared for human consumption. Grains and beans meant for animals were typically of lower quality than those grown for humans, often containing more chaff, stones, and dirt. Nevertheless, these could be cleaned as well as possible and cooked into porridge. Frozen carrots eaten raw demonstrates the abandonment of normal food preparation practices. Root vegetables that froze in the ground or in storage would typically be considered damaged and used only for animal feed under normal circumstances. During food shortages, these frost-damaged vegetables would be consumed raw, as fuel for cooking was often as scarce as the food itself. Chalk or dirt added as filler represents perhaps the most desperate attempt to create the illusion of adequate food. With no nutritional value, these substances were added to meager meals simply to create volume and a temporary feeling of fullness. Clay eating, geophagia, has been documented in extreme famine conditions across many cultures and time periods. Beer dregs used in cooking shows the complete utilization of every possible food source. The sediment left at the bottom of beer barrels, consisting primarily of dead yeast, would be carefully collected and added to bread dough or soup for its slight nutritional value. Yeast is relatively protein-rich compared to many foods available during famines, making these dregs surprisingly valuable. The historical record of these desperate measures comes primarily from chronicles written during or after major famines, court records documenting food crimes, and archaeological evidence. Many accounts describe adults forgoing food entirely so that children might have what little was available. Infanticide and child abandonment rates increased during the worst famines, as families became unable to feed all their members. The psychological impact of these desperate measures lasted long after crises ended. Many medieval writings describe the shame survivors felt at having eaten foods considered taboo or disgusting under normal circumstances. Religious authorities occasionally issued special dispensations absolving people of sin for consuming forbidden foods during confirmed famines. Their knowledge of emergency foods, what could be eaten, how it must be prepared, and what risks it carried, represented crucial survival information passed down through generations, helping communities endure through history's harshest periods.